At the turn of the 20th century, America was intoxicated by wealth. Steel magnates, railroad barons, and industrial tycoons reshaped the nation at a speed the world had never witnessed. Fortunes were no longer inherited slowly over generations. They were forged violently, almost overnight. This era would come to be known as the Gilded Age, a time of glittering surfaces, extraordinary ambition, and staggering inequality. And in the quiet suburbs outside Philadelphia, one man decided to build a house that would not merely display wealth, but declare dominance. That house was Lynnewood Hall, the man behind the palace. The creator of Lynnewood Hall was Peter A.B. Widener, one of the most powerful and wealthy men in America. Widener was not a visionary in the romantic sense. He was a strategist, a financier, a man who understood leverage, control, and permanence. His fortune was built through streetcars, railroads, real estate, and strategic investments, most notably his early backing of the United States Steel Corporation. By the late 1800s, Widener had joined the inner circle of American industrial aristocracy. But money alone was not enough. Widener wanted legacy. In an era when European aristocracy still looked down on American wealth as crude and temporary, Widener sought to prove that the new world could rival the old, not just economically, but culturally. Lynnewood Hall would be his argument, choosing grandeur over restraint. Widener did not want a country house. He wanted a palace. To design it, he hired Horace Trumbauer, one of the most prominent architects of America's elite. Trumbauer was known for creating monumental estates that borrowed heavily from European classical traditions, particularly French and English aristocratic architecture. Construction began in 1897 in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania, a quiet, wooded area far enough from Philadelphia to ensure privacy, but close enough to remain connected to power. Widener gave Trumbauer an almost impossible directive: build something that makes a statement the moment it is seen. The result was overwhelming. Architecture of excess. Completed in 1900, Lynnewood Hall was built in the neoclassical revival style, inspired by European palaces and grand estates. Its scale was staggering: over 110 rooms, approximately 70,000 square feet, massive limestone facade, colonnades, balustrades, and symmetrical wings. A central structure designed to dominate the landscape. This was not architecture meant to blend in. It was meant to command. Inside, the house featured marble floors imported from Europe, hand-carved woodwork, and ceilings designed to echo with conversation. Everything about the building communicated one message. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing here was modest. A home designed to impress the world. Lynnewood Hall was never meant to be a retreat. It was a stage. Widener used the mansion to host lavish gatherings for America's elite, industrialists, politicians, cultural leaders, and foreign guests. These were not casual dinners. They were demonstrations of power, refinement, and cultural ambition. Widener's art collection alone rivaled European museums. Masterpieces filled the halls, chosen not only for beauty, but for legitimacy. He wanted to show that American wealth could purchase not just luxury, but taste. In many ways, Lynnewood Hall functioned as an unofficial embassy of American aristocracy, a family and a future. Despite its grandeur, Lynnewood Hall was also intended as a family estate. Widener envisioned it passing through generations, a permanent seat of influence. His son, George Dunton Widener, was deeply involved in society life and shared his father's appreciation for luxury and culture. But history does not respect intention, and the future Widener imagined would fracture violently, far from the marble halls of Lynnewood. A shadow approaching. In April 1912, George Widener boarded a new, much-celebrated ocean liner for a return voyage from Europe. Its name was Titanic. He would never return. The disaster claimed George Widener's life, along with hundreds of others, sending shockwaves through the world and shattering Peter Widener's vision of dynastic continuity. Lynnewood Hall, built as a monument to permanence, suddenly felt fragile, and the palace that had been designed to host generations would instead become a witness to loss. A house built too well. After the Titanic tragedy, Widener withdrew increasingly from public life. Lynnewood Hall remained, immaculately maintained, but its purpose began to shift. What was once a symbol of ascension slowly became a container for memory. Rooms designed for celebration fell quiet. Hallways echoed without footsteps. The house had been built too well, too grand, to adapt easily to a changing world. And America itself was changing, the beginning of an end. By the time Peter Widener died in 1915, the world that had created Lynnewood Hall was already fading. The Gilded Age was ending. Public attitudes toward wealth were shifting. The First World War loomed. Lynnewood Hall stood complete, but its moment had passed almost as soon as it arrived. What remained was a palace without a clear future, and a question no one could yet answer. What happens when a house is built for an empire that no longer exists? At its height, Lynnewood Hall was not merely a residence. It was a machine of prestige. Every corridor, every column, every carefully framed view across the estate served a singular purpose: to reinforce the idea that its owner belonged to a class above time, uncertainty, and consequence. For Peter A.B. Widener, wealth was not something to enjoy quietly. It was something to demonstrate with discipline, and Lynnewood Hall was the instrument through which that discipline was expressed. A household built on hierarchy. Daily life at Lynnewood Hall followed a rigid structure that mirrored European aristocratic estates. The household employed dozens of servants, butlers, maids, footmen, cooks, gardeners, and maintenance staff, each assigned specific roles and movements within the house. The architecture itself enforced this hierarchy. Servants' staircases were hidden. Corridors intersected without crossing public spaces. Entire sections of the house existed to keep labor invisible. To guests, the mansion appeared effortless. In reality, it functioned through constant, coordinated effort. Meals appeared silently. Rooms were maintained without interruption. Fires were lit before guests entered. Everything was prepared in advance so that the illusion of ease was never broken. This was not hospitality. It was choreography. Entertaining as a display of power. Entertaining at Lynnewood Hall was strategic. Widener hosted lavish dinners, receptions, and cultural gatherings attended by financiers, politicians, diplomats, and members of America's emerging elite. These events were carefully curated, not only to impress, but to position Widener socially. Guests were seated intentionally. Conversations were guided subtly. Artworks were placed where they would provoke admiration. The message was clear. This was not new money trying to belong. This was power already seated at the table. The dining rooms echoed with controlled laughter and measured dialogue. Even leisure carried weight. Nothing at Lynnewood Hall was casual. Art as authority. Widener's art collection was among the most significant in the United States at the time. He acquired works by European masters not simply for appreciation, but for legitimacy. Art, in Widener's world, was proof that American wealth could command European culture. Paintings, sculptures, and tapestries filled the halls, each piece selected to communicate refinement rather than indulgence. Guests did not merely view art at Lynnewood Hall. They were meant to feel educated by it. This philosophy would later influence Widener's descendants, ultimately contributing to the founding of major public collections, including what would become the National Gallery of Art. But within Lynnewood, art was private power, visible only to those invited inside. the family within the palace. Despite its scale, Lynnewood Hall was intended to function as a family home. Peter Widener's son, George Dunton Widener, played a prominent role in society life. He shared his father's appreciation for status, culture, and spectacle, and often acted as host during major gatherings. Family life, however, unfolded within strict boundaries. Children were raised with formality. Emotional expression was reserved. Public image mattered deeply. Even grief, when it came, was expected to remain controlled. The mansion did not encourage intimacy. It encouraged distance. And in that distance, something essential was lost: comfort without warmth. Lynnewood Hall was luxurious, but it was not cozy. Its rooms were vast, ceilings high, and proportions deliberately grand. Fireplaces provided heat, but the scale of the spaces often overwhelmed any sense of comfort. Visitors frequently remarked on the house's beauty and its chill, not physical coldness. Emotional, the palace impressed. It did not embrace. This was not a flaw in design. It was intentional. Lynnewood Hall was built to elevate its occupants above ordinary human experience. Comfort was secondary to presence, a world unaware of its fragility. At the dawn of the 20th century, it seemed unimaginable that a house like Lynnewood Hall could ever fall into irrelevance. The Widener fortune appeared secure. The American economy surged. The elite gathered confidently beneath marble ceilings. But history does not announce itself. It moves quietly, waiting for moments of fracture. And that fracture would come, not in Elkins Park, but on the open sea. The Titanic and the shattering of continuity. In April 1912, George Widener boarded the RMS Titanic, returning from Europe. The disaster that followed was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a symbolic rupture. The heir to Lynnewood Hall was gone. The future Widener imagined, a lineage rooted in marble and legacy, collapsed in a single night. When news reached Pennsylvania, the palace did not change. The halls remained polished. The art stayed in place. The servants continued their routines. But the purpose of the house had been damaged beyond repair. Mourning in silence, Peter Widener never fully recovered. He retreated from society, spending less time entertaining and more time withdrawn within the walls of the very house he had built to celebrate life. Lynnewood Hall became quieter. Rooms once filled with voices stood empty. Dinners were fewer. Guests became rare. The palace transitioned from a symbol of ascendancy to a container of grief. And grief, when unexpressed, settles into architecture, a lifestyle losing its relevance. As the years passed, the world outside Lynnewood Hall began to reject the values it represented. Public opinion shifted against extreme wealth. Progressive reforms targeted the excesses of industrial barons. The First World War reshaped global priorities. The aristocratic lifestyle Lynnewood embodied began to look out of place, sundrew offensive. What once signified success now invited scrutiny, and the house, so carefully built for permanence, found itself increasingly disconnected from the future. The illusion of stability. To an outsider, Lynnewood Hall still appeared invincible. Its stone walls were immaculate, its grounds maintained, its scale undiminished. But inside, the energy that once animated the palace had faded. The Widener Empire remained wealthy, but its cultural moment had passed. Lynnewood Hall had been built for an age of certainty, and certainty was gone. The end of an era, not a building. By the time Peter Widener died in 1915, Lynnewood Hall stood complete, but emotionally unfinished. It had reached its peak almost as soon as it had been completed. The palace had achieved everything it was designed to do, and in doing so, it had exhausted its purpose. What remained was a magnificent structure waiting for a future it could not yet imagine. After 1915, The world that had given birth to Lynnewood Hall no longer existed. The Gilded Age had collapsed under its own excess. The optimism that once justified palaces in quiet suburbs was replaced by skepticism, reform, and the looming shadow of global conflict. Wealth remained, but its meaning had changed. What followed was not an abrupt fall. It was a long, quiet retreat, an estate without an heir. Peter A.B. Widener's death marked the end of Lynnewood Hall as a dynastic seat. Without George Widener, the heir Widener had prepared to inherit not just wealth, but presence. The house lost its intended future. Ownership passed within the family, but purpose did not. Lynnewood was no longer a stage for society. It was no longer a symbol of ascent. It became something far more dangerous to a house of such scale. It became optional. The mansion was still maintained. Staff remained. The grounds were cared for. But the rituals that once animated the estate were gone. There were fewer guests, fewer reasons to gather, fewer moments that required rooms to be filled. And buildings designed for spectacle do not age well in silence. America moves on. The 1920s brought a new kind of wealth, faster, flashier, less tied to European ideals. Skyscrapers replaced palaces as symbols of success. Urban life eclipsed country estates. Then came the Great Depression. Even families who retained their fortunes faced public pressure to appear restrained. Grand estates became liabilities, expensive to maintain, difficult to justify, and increasingly out of step with public sentiment. Lynnewood Hall, with its monumental scale and unapologetic grandeur, stood as a reminder of a world many wanted to forget. The house did not shrink, but its relevance did. A shift from home to burden. By the mid-20th century, the Widener family no longer used Lynnewood Hall as a primary residence. The house transitioned into something far more precarious, a legacy property without a lifestyle to support it. Maintenance continued out of obligation rather than desire. Rooms were closed off. Wings were rarely entered. The mansion functioned at a fraction of its capacity. Heating a house of that size was costly. Staffing it fully was impractical. Adapting it for modern living would have required compromising the very qualities that defined it. And so, like many Gilded Age palaces, Lynnewood entered a state of suspended existence. Not abandoned, but no longer alive. The illusion of preservation. From the outside, Lynnewood Hall still looked magnificent. Its limestone facade weathered time well. The symmetry remained intact. The estate grounds, though quieter, still conveyed order. This illusion delayed urgency. As long as the building appeared preserved, there was no immediate crisis. But architecture is deceptive. Buildings deteriorate most rapidly when they are unused, not when they are occupied. Water infiltration, temperature fluctuations, neglect of interior systems. These were silent forces working patiently. Inside, paint peeled, wood warped, mechanical systems aged beyond repair. What could not be seen from the road began to fail. The house was aging without witnesses. Attempts at reinvention. Over the decades, proposals surfaced to save Lynnewood Hall by giving it a new identity. Ideas included a museum, a cultural center, an institutional facility, a luxury redevelopment. Each proposal encountered the same obstacles. The building was too large, too expensive, too inflexible. Adaptive reuse requires compromise. Lynnewood resisted compromise by design. Its rooms were ceremonial, not modular. Its structure prioritized symmetry over practicality. Its scale overwhelmed modern needs. Saving it would require either immense public funding or a private benefactor willing to lose money for legacy alone. Neither materialized. The sound of absence. As years passed, Lynnewood Hall grew quieter, not because it was sealed, but because it was forgotten. Occasional caretakers passed through its halls. Inspectors documented deterioration, but no one lived there in the way it had been meant to be lived. Silence settled differently than before. This was not the controlled quiet of elite privacy. This was emptiness. Rooms designed to host hundreds now held air. Staircases echoed without footsteps. Windows framed landscapes no one watched change. The mansion became a container for absence. The psychological weight of too much space. Large abandoned structures produce a unique psychological effect. They were built for voices, movement, and ritual. When those elements disappear, the scale becomes oppressive. Distance feels exaggerated. Time feels suspended. Those who entered Lynnewood during this period often described a sensation not of fear, but of dislocation. The house felt unfinished, not ruined, paused, as if waiting for instructions that would never arrive. Public awareness without action. As awareness of Lynnewood Hall's condition slowly spread, preservationists raised concerns. Articles appeared. Photographs circulated. People expressed outrage, fascination, regret. But outrage without ownership leads nowhere. The house was privately owned. Intervention was limited. Legal protections were weak. And without a viable plan, concern remained abstract. Lynnewood existed in a gray zone between landmark and liability. Too significant to ignore. Too impractical to save. A symbol of a broken model. By the end of the 20th century, Lynnewood Hall had become something it was never meant to be. A case study in failure. Not architectural failure, not structural failure, but cultural failure. It represented the limits of private wealth as a vehicle for permanence. A reminder that even the most ambitious expressions of power depend on continuity, and that continuity is fragile. The house had been built to outlast generations. It did, but generations changed, waiting in plain sight. Unlike ruins hidden in forests or remote landscapes, Lynnewood Hall waited in plain sight. Cars passed nearby. Neighborhoods developed around it. Life continued. The palace stood still, its fate unresolved, its future unclaimed, its past undeniable. And in that unresolved state, it entered its most haunting phase, not as a myth, but as a warning. When a building reaches a certain scale, it stops being judged as architecture and starts being judged as an idea. By the late 20th century, Lynnewood Hall was no longer discussed as a former home, or even as a neglected estate. It was discussed as a problem, and problems invite stories. The birth of modern myths. Unlike medieval castles or ancient ruins, Lynnewood Hall did not have centuries of folklore behind it. Its myths were modern, born from neglect, frustration, and disbelief. People asked the same question repeatedly. How could something this grand be allowed to decay? When there was no satisfying answer, imagination stepped in. Stories began to circulate. That the house was cursed. That previous owners were afraid of it. That something about the building made it impossible to save. None of these claims were true, but they were emotionally convenient. They shifted responsibility away from human decisions and onto fate. Ruin without romance. There is a romantic language surrounding ruins. We speak of ivy-covered walls, poetic decay, beauty in collapse. But Lynnewood Hall never fit that narrative. Its decline was not picturesque. It was administrative. Paint peeled because no one repainted it. Systems failed because they were no longer maintained. Rooms decayed because they were never used again. This was not a dramatic fall. It was paperwork, hesitation, and delay. And that made it harder to care about. Why preservation failed? Preservation requires three things: legal protection, financial commitment, a future use. Lynnewood Hall consistently lacked at least one of these. While recognized as historically significant, it did not receive the level of landmark protection necessary to force intervention. Its private ownership complicated public involvement, and its sheer size discouraged realistic reuse. Saving the building would require tens of millions of dollars, without a clear path to return on investment. In a culture that values efficiency, Lynnewood offered none. The scale problem. Lynnewood Hall was not just large, it was too complete. Its rooms were designed for a lifestyle that no longer existed. Converting them into apartments, offices, or public spaces would mean destroying their proportions, symmetry, and intent. Preservationists faced an impossible choice: save the structure by altering it beyond recognition, or preserve its integrity and accept its decay. Neither option satisfied everyone, so nothing happened. Public outrage, private inaction. Occasionally, photographs of Lynnewood's interior would surface: dust-covered halls, damaged ceilings, abandoned furniture. Each time, public reaction followed a familiar pattern: shock, anger, calls for action, and then silence. Because outrage does not write checks, the building remained privately owned. Responsibility remained concentrated, and without legal force or funding, concern faded as quickly as it appeared. Lynnewood became famous for being unsaved. Abandonment as a mirror. What made Lynnewood Hall uncomfortable was not just its decay, but what that decay revealed. It exposed the limits of admiration without responsibility. People loved the idea of preservation, but resisted the cost. The mansion became a mirror reflecting modern values. We celebrate history, but avoid maintaining it. We romanticize legacy, but reject obligation. We share images of decay, but rarely intervene. Lynnewood was not forgotten. It was observed without commitment. The psychology of too big to save. There is a threshold beyond which preservation becomes psychologically impossible. When a building is small, it feels manageable. When it is massive, it feels abstract. Lynnewood crossed that threshold. People did not ask, "How can I help?" They asked, "Why hasn't someone fixed this?" Responsibility dissolved into distance. And distance is lethal to preservation. Not haunted, just unlived. Urban explorers who entered Lynnewood often described it as eerie. But not because of ghosts. Because of absence. There were no signs of sudden abandonment. No overturned furniture. No frozen moments in time. Everything had simply stopped being used. That kind of emptiness is unsettling. It suggests not catastrophe, but surrender. A slow, collective decision to let something fade. A palace without defenders. Historic buildings survive when someone claims them emotionally and materially. Lynnewood had admirers. It did not have defenders. No single institution took ownership of its future. No family member reasserted its purpose. No public body stepped in decisively. The house existed in limbo, too important to demolish, too inconvenient to rescue. What ruin really means. Ruin is often misunderstood as collapse. In reality, ruin is continuation without intention. Lynnewood continued to exist physically, but without direction. And in architecture, direction matters as much as structure. The house did not decay because it was weak. It decayed because it was finished. Finished with the world that had created it. A warning written in stone. By the early 21st century, Lynnewood Hall had become a cautionary example, not of excess, not of arrogance, but of a broken promise. The promise that wealth alone can guarantee permanence. The promise that beauty will always inspire protection. The promise that history saves itself. It does not. Waiting for meaning again. Like all great abandoned structures, Lynnewood Hall waits. Not for restoration, not for demolition, but for meaning. Until someone decides what the building is for, it remains suspended, an object lesson in how even the grandest visions can outlive their usefulness. There are buildings that survive by adapting. There are buildings that survive by being useful. And then there are buildings that survive simply by remaining unresolved. Today, Lynnewood Hall belongs to the last category. It stands not as a functioning estate, not as a preserved museum, and not as a celebrated ruin, but as a question that has never been answered. A palace out of time, Lynnewood Hall does not feel ancient. It feels prematurely obsolete. Its architecture speaks the language of European aristocracy, yet it exists in a nation that rejected aristocracy as an identity. It was built to project permanence in a culture that rewards reinvention. This contradiction defines its present. The house was never meant to age into practicality. It was meant to endure unchanged, an assumption that modern America quietly refused to honor. And so Lynnewood exists outside time, too modern to be a relic, too old to be useful. The end of the Gilded promise. Lynnewood Hall represents the final, fragile promise of the Gilded Age, that wealth could purchase not just comfort, but immortality. Peter A. B. Widener believed that scale equaled significance. That stone could secure memory, that a palace could outlast politics, economics, and culture. He was not naive. He was simply wrong. The Gilded Age produced extraordinary architecture, but it failed to produce systems capable of sustaining it. The fortunes remained, but the lifestyle that justified palaces did not. Lynnewood Hall exposes that gap with brutal clarity. A building that refuses to be rewritten. Many historic estates survive by being rewritten. They become hotels. They become event venues. They become museums. Lynnewood resists all of these identities, not because it cannot be transformed, but because transformation would require concession. Walls would have to move. Rooms would have to shrink. Proportions would have to be violated. To save Lynnewood in this way would mean losing the very thing that makes it important. And so it remains untouched, not preserved, but unaltered. This is not stubbornness. It is consequence. The ethics of letting go. There is an uncomfortable question that Lynnewood Hall forces into view. Is it always right to save a building? Preservation is often framed as moral obligation. But obligation without function becomes ritual, and ritual without belief becomes performance. Lynnewood challenges the idea that all history must be maintained indefinitely, especially when that history represents inequality, excess, and exclusion. To preserve it unquestioningly is to romanticize a system that no longer exists, and perhaps should not. Yet to let it decay feels equally wrong. The building exists at the intersection of guilt and admiration. Why we still look. Despite its unresolved state, Lynnewood Hall continues to fascinate. Photographs circulate. Essays are written. Documentaries mention it in passing. People ask why nothing has been done, and then move on. The house endures not because it is functional, but because it is symbolic. It symbolizes the limits of private wealth, the fragility of legacy, the danger of building for status rather than adaptability. It is studied not as architecture, but as outcome, a mirror, not a monument. Unlike celebrated landmarks, Lynnewood Hall does not tell us who we were. It tells us who we thought we would become. A nation confident enough to build palaces, a society wealthy enough to sustain them, a culture willing to carry excess forward indefinitely. None of those assumptions survived, and so Lynnewood stands, not as a monument to achievement, but as a mirror reflecting ambition without infrastructure. The silence that teaches. Silence is often mistaken for emptiness, but in places like Lynnewood Hall, silence instructs. It teaches that architecture cannot exist independently of culture, that buildings require not just materials, but belief, that legacy must be maintained intentionally, or it dissolves. Lynnewood was built to speak loudly. Today, it teaches quietly, the possibility that remains. Lynnewood Hall is not ruined beyond hope. It could still be restored. It could still be repurposed. It could still be saved. But any future would require honesty about cost, about meaning, and about what would be lost in the process. Until that honesty arrives, the house waits. Not for rescue, but for clarity. What Lynnewood ultimately is. Lynnewood Hall is not haunted. It is not cursed. It is not a failure of architecture. It is a failure of assumption. The assumption that wealth guarantees permanence. The assumption that beauty ensures protection. The assumption that history preserves itself. It does not. History survives only when someone decides it should. A final stillness. As seasons pass and light shifts across its columns, Lynnewood Hall remains unmoving, neither collapsing nor reviving. It does not ask for attention. It does not demand sympathy. It simply exists. A palace without a role. A legacy without heirs. A question without an answer. And perhaps that is its final purpose. To stand as proof that even the grandest visions must eventually confront the future they were never designed to face.